Can you recall a time that a song was played constantly on the radio, and yet no one seemed to actually like it? I'm not talking about Who Let the Dogs Out. That song slayed. But their follow-up single, Move It Like This, Well, in the mid-2000s, a ton of bands were caught, or rather, their labels were caught, paying for plays on the radio. Something that's not only cringy and embarrassing, but also, in fact, illegal. The 2005 Payola scandal was one of the last great caught with your pants down moments for the music industry. Among the thousands of emails released by New York's Attorney General were glimpses of corruption.
If your station adds and accumulates 60 spins of Pat Green's Guys Like Me, we will fly a station member plus one.
Desperation.
What do I have to do to get Audioslave on WKSS this week? Whatever you can dream up, I can make it happen.
Deception.
Please make sure the callers are women 20 to 28 years old. And please make sure they don't get caught.
And greed.
You have room for a money record this week? 311 Lovesong, big money, money, money.
Even stranger is how little this scandal is talked about today, despite the fact that many of the bands involved are still active. Not that they necessarily knew what was going on, or could have stopped it if they wanted to. But hey, if we can't use the internet to poke fun at washed up bands from our childhood, then I don't know what it's even here for. To begin this story, we must take a time machine back to the early 2000s. A simpler time, when having a turntable in a metal band just made sense. When getting new music meant downloading from LimeWire overnight. And, more to the point, a time when radio still mattered. Not just mattered, but was huge. Today, very few people use the radio to discover new music. But back then, it was a force. People had favorite DJs. They called in to request songs, or to win concert tickets and other prizes.
Hello, Rock 107. Am I the 107th caller?
And if you were from New York State, the early 2000s was also a time you heard a lot about this guy, Eliot Spitzer, then Attorney General of New York State. Yes, a few years later, he would leave the governor's office in shame, his habit of visiting high-end prostitutes exposed. But back in 2004, he was something of a rock star, a bold civil servant standing up to Wall Street and corrupt corporations. As biographer Brooke A. Masters put it, when he ventured outside his downtown Manhattan office, he couldn't walk 2 blocks without being stopped by well-wishers who praised him for standing up to big business. Tipsters jammed his office phone lines with tales of woe and financial malfeasance. What's more, his investigations got results. Huge penalties from corporations brought the state much-needed funding and made him a rising star in the Democratic Party. So it may come as no surprise that, of all the attorney generals in the country, Eliot Spitzer was the one who noticed something fishy going on in the music business. In 2004, he subpoenaed the 4 major record companies. His office gained access to years' worth of emails, which were later partially released to the public. And what they revealed was the awful, salacious, dirty crime of Good Charlotte bribing radio stations with PlayStation games? Okay, so let's explain what all the fuss is about. The basis of this scandal was something called payola. Payola is defined as the practice of bribing someone to use their influence to promote a particular product or interest. It's basically what every influencer does, and we as a society are okay with that until it crosses an ethical line.
I mean, I've got this thing, and it's golden.
For example, let's say you're a janitor at a radio station, and one day on your way to work, a man in a trench coat gives you $100. In return, he wants you to slip a song into the daily rotation. If it happens once, no big deal. But if it happens again and again, people will start to notice. the listeners who are forced to hear subpar music, the radio station owner who is getting undercut, and the other bands who now can't get a foot in the door because all the airtime is bought up. Back in the 1950s, this became a major issue, so much so that the government had to step in and shut things down. They laid out a set of requirements that basically made payola illegal, and thus quality radio programming thrived, and everyone lived happily ever after.
Payola wants this one dedicated to...
Of course not. Being the ultra-competitive, no-guts, no-glory world that the music business is, record labels did everything they could to keep providing a steady stream of bribes.
Here, take this ounce and going home of cocaine. You take this, and I'll give you a call Tuesday.
If you're interested, we have a whole other video on this. But for now, we're going to fast forward back to the aughts.
The Grammy Awards reward the music industry's top artists, but New York State Attorney General Eliot Spitzer says record labels have been rewarding the radio stations that play their songs with bribes and cash.
Within these 300-odd pages of emails were messages sent between record label employees and radio stations, or internally between staff. Some were merely expense reports submitted to their bosses. They'd indicate what they purchased, for how much money, who it was for, and what they got in return. In this case, Toby Lightman ad means that the singer-songwriter was added to the radio station's playlist, WFLY. Or take this email that indicates $134 was paid for a Marriott hotel room in order to increase the number of spins or plays for the artist Jewel on WBBO.
They were actually effectively buying space on the air.
They were buying space on the air and buying space on the charts.
Since payola was technically illegal, the record labels typically avoided sending straight cash. Instead, they'd pay for airfare, hotel rooms, Yankee tickets, IT bills, and laptops. During one strange promotion for the Killer Mike single, Adidas, Sony Music devised a plan to send a single Adidas sneaker to a number of disc jockeys. Then, after a DJ played the record at least 10 times, they would be sent the other match. Now, you might be thinking, a hotel room here, a laptop there, what's the big deal? Well, these little deals are just scratching the surface. Throughout these documents, you get a few hints at the true dollar amount being spent. One email mentions paying $4,000 to get Franz Ferdinand added to a single radio station. Another mentions spending $17,000 on Good Charlotte in a single week, a payment that only resulted in 250 plays, to the label's disappointment. Over $76,000 was spent one summer for the Christian rock band Pillar. Over $300,000 on one single for the girl group Dream. And sure, maybe for those last two bands you're thinking, who? The bands who needed payola tended not to be the most successful. But there were also a lot of big names in these emails that will make you scratch your head. There's an email from a Virgin Records employee that outlines how much they're paying radio stations to play the new single from Blur, Crazy Beat. The amount varying depending on the station's size. Or take the case of Pearl Jam, whose label, Epic Records, spent a whopping $250,000 on a payola scheme that didn't even work. Back in 2003, Pearl Jam were just past their glory days of the 90s, and struggling to get airplay for their new album, Riot Act. To remedy that, the band agreed to play a show at Orlando's House of Blues, where lucky fans would be flown in to see them in a close-up, intimate setting. The tickets were given to 18 radio stations, who would award them to listeners during on-air contests. It was a win-win deal. A huge free promo for the radio stations, and extra airplay for the band. That is, assuming the radio stations held up their end of the bargain. As the email from Epic Records went, We were promised a minimum of 6 weeks of heavy promotion and airplay leading up to this club show. However, the actual airplay numbers were dismal at best. One LA radio station had played the new tracks a mere 6 times, and they were receiving 100 free tickets with airfare. The email concludes, "It seems to be a big waste of time and money, and I feel bad that I even talked the band into it." This brings us to another point about these emails. A big part of what's so entertaining about them is seeing these bigwigs get humbled. Bands who seemed so effortlessly cool and popular, in fact, needed an army of promoters to fight for each and every spin.
Everyone must bear down. 19-2000 had a rough Thursday yesterday.
Fix WBLI now. We did not pay for that goddamn promotion of the Video Music Awards for 1 spin a day!
There's Universal Music employees lamenting how difficult it is to buy spins for Newfound Glory because they are, quote, not an A-level act to modern rock radio. Ouch, coming from your own label, too. There's Virgin Records telling a radio station, and I'm paraphrasing here, "Hey, you guys didn't play the new N.E.R.D single enough times, so we aren't going to pay you. Yes, we realize it was a flop, but you still should have played it. Thanks, Rick." There's the sheer number of times that Good Charlotte gets mentioned. Their record label, Sony Music, had to give out plane tickets, DVD players, Disney vacations, meet and greets, billbacks, and of course the aforementioned PS2 games. One email acknowledges that the program director at WKSE, quote, hates Good Charlotte, but still agreed to give the band some spins during the overnight hours. Good enough to fool the charts, even if no one's listening. Okay guys, quick pause here, and I promise this is not an ad break. I just want to give a shout out to our animator. You can check out his stuff at PartyKaleta on Instagram. Also, if you're enjoying this video, check out the rest of the channel for more deep dives into cool genres and weird music history. If you find yourself craving even more, we have a Patreon with more videos and features. And back to the story. Perhaps the best example of record labels revealing their desperation was when they paid for fake call-in campaigns. For example, if you thought you heard DMX's Where's the Hood At a lot in August 2003, that might be because Universal Music paid a team of people to call radio stations across the country and request the tune. They were hired to do this 30 times per week for 6 weeks at 59 different radio stations. That's a lot of phone calls. What's also amusing is how the gender, age, and ethnicity of callers was specifically requested. For Ashanti, it was females aged 18 to 24, all black. For Norah Jones, it was simply women 20 to 28 years old. For Ludacris, it was mostly women with a few dudes thrown in for good measure. And for Brie Larson, it was, hang on a second, 11 to 13-year-old girls? Doesn't that violate child labor laws? And I'm sure some of you are thinking, okay, so the major record labels were slimy. Big deal. I don't even listen to pop radio. I listen to the cool stuff that Bandsplaining recommends on his Patreon. And hey, perfectly valid response. But before you walk away, let me tell you about one particularly dark chapter. After the initial revelations came out, the independent record label TSR Records opened a lawsuit against the majors. They claimed that, in addition to paying for airplay, the major labels had essentially created a cartel that kept smaller labels off the radio. TSR Records was a mom-and-pop operation. They got their start in the early 80s releasing dance and techno music. By the 2000s, their biggest artist was the indie rock band Get Set Go, who were flying high after their song Break Your Heart was featured on Grey's Anatomy.
I am naked in the shower. I'm gonna break your heart. I'm gonna let you down.
But while the song was a hit on college radio, it was effectively locked out from commercial stations, at least according to label owner Tom Hayden. Now, I'll let you judge for yourself whether or not Get Set Go could have been the next Bowling for Soup. But as far as the courts were concerned, there was merit to the lawsuit. The judge denied Sony's motion to dismiss, and after a few years of litigation, it was settled out of court. I asked Mr. Hayden if he could share details about the trial, but he informed me that, as part of the settlement agreement, he could not speak any further. We unfortunately may never know what additional evidence came to light. But I think this points to a much more sinister aspect of Payola. It's not just about Josh Groban giving out gift cards to Medell's Sporting Goods. It's about how this causes smaller labels to get systematically shut out. When you add it all up, there were 140 different bands and artists who were mentioned in at least one email. I'm not going to go as far as to say they all committed Payola, in part because I really don't want to get sued. But frankly, some of the language is a bit vague. Employees are talking about hypothetical deals that we can't confirm actually happened. This DJ was given free tickets to the big memorial concert right after 9/11. Come on, Gary. That's like double wrong. When all was said and done, each of the record labels settled with the state of New York. $5 million for Warner, $3.75 million for EMI, $10 million for Sony, and $12 million for Universal. For a little context here, Universal had just under $6 billion in revenue that same year. So this fine was only about 0.2% of that. The money was paid to the Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, who in turn distributed it to New York State charities. The record labels never admitted any wrongdoing. No employees or executives were charged. They merely acknowledged that some of their employees pursued, quote, improper promotion practices, and really super duper promised not to do it again. Now, in case you're wondering, Payola is definitely still happening today. In fact, it has evolved to cover the world of Spotify playlists. But I'll let you peep our other video if you want to hear all about that. Alright, nostalgia trip over. Enjoy these closing memories, and don't forget to support the channel.